She asked herself a question that became her new compass. What would it look like to grow from this, not just survive it? That question lit a fire inside her, not for revenge, not to win him back, but for herself. She realized how much of her identity had been tied to being enough for someone who didn't choose her completely, and she was done with that version of herself, the one who twisted and shrank just to fit into someone else's inconsistent affection. She got a haircut, not to prove a point, but to release the past. She updated her wardrobe, not to impress anyone else, but to wear confidence like a second skin. Her mornings started earlier. She joined a fitness class, not because she wanted to post about it, but because it reminded her what strength felt like in her own body. She stopped posting cryptic quotes on social media. Instead, she started showing up in real life, with presence, with energy, with joy. Little by little, her life began to glow. Not from perfection, but from intention. She wasn't pretending to be okay anymore. She was becoming okay, from the inside out. People noticed. Friends said she looked lighter, stronger, more grounded. Strangers smiled back more often. But the most important shift was the one she felt inside. Like she had stopped waiting for someone else to make her feel worthy. She began to realize that the glow up wasn't about changing herself to become someone he would want back. It was about returning to the woman she was before she ever questioned her value, before she confused his lack of commitment with a lack of worth. Before she mistook effort for love, Jenna was no longer performing, she was healing. And healing looked really, really good on her. Then the inevitable happened. His name popped up on her phone one evening. "Hey, you've been on my mind lately." She read the message without emotion, not because she didn't care, but because she finally saw clearly it wasn't about missing her. He missed the version of her that always showed up, no matter how many times he disappeared. But that version was gone. She didn't glow up for him. She didn't evolve to get noticed. She did it because she got tired of her own pain, of waiting, of wishing. And now that she was finally at peace, his message felt small. She didn't respond right away, not to play a game, but because she had nothing to prove anymore. She was no longer trying to show him what he lost. She was busy experiencing what she found, herself. The peace in her silence wasn't about pride, it was about protection. She had worked hard to get here, to build a life that didn't orbit around someone else's inconsistency, to create joy that wasn't dependent on external validation. She had created rituals that nourished her, walks in the morning sun, books that challenged her mind, conversations with people who saw her clearly. That kind of richness couldn't be interrupted by a text. Jenna wasn't anti-love. She still believed in connection, in chemistry, in deep bonds. But now she understood something deeper. Attraction without respect is nothing. Affection without consistency is noise. And she was no longer accepting noise. If someone wanted to be in her life now, they would have to come with clarity, with effort, with presence. The kind that says, "I see you," not just "I miss you." And if they couldn't, she would still be whole. That was the difference. She had become the woman she used to think she needed a relationship to become. That realization was worth more than any closure. She remembered the girl she used to be, the one who waited by the phone, who sent long texts, trying to explain her heart, who accepted half love just to feel something. She sent that version of herself love, not shame, because that girl only wanted to feel seen, wanted to feel chosen. But Jenna had learned that the most powerful choice is the one you make for yourself. The choice to rise, to grow, to stop begging for love and start embodying it. She no longer romanticized someone who couldn't show up. She romanticized herself, her future, her becoming. That was the most beautiful plot twists. His texts continued, more frequent, more curious, but she didn't rush. Her energy had shifted. She no longer felt the need to explain her silence or her healing. If he asked, she would tell the truth, but she wouldn't apologize for the space she created. That space was her sanctuary. It was where she met the version of herself that didn't settle, didn't chase, didn't shrink. And in that space, she had rebuilt everything, her confidence, her dreams, her joy. She finally saw that the real glow up wasn't physical. It was spiritual, mental, emotional, and it was hers. When she finally replied, it wasn't dramatic. It was grounded, clear. I hope you're doing well. I've been focused on myself lately. It's been good. She left it at that. No over-explaining, no fishing for validation, just truth. And he felt the shift. Not in her words, but in her energy. She wasn't reaching back from a place of emptiness. She was speaking from fullness. That kind of woman is unforgettable. Not because of how much she gave, but because of how much she grew. That's what people feel even through a screen. And that's why they always come back when the glow up is real. Lena sat in her favorite coffee shop, a journal open in front of her and a pen resting gently between her fingers. The smell of roasted beans and the low hum of quiet conversations filled the space. But her mind was somewhere else. She had spent the last few months untangling her emotions like a web, pulling one strand at a time, asking herself the questions she used to avoid. The hardest one was, why did I keep chasing someone who showed me he wasn't ready? It stung. But that question was the beginning of her truth, a truth that no longer needed permission to be felt. She had once mistaken effort for connection. If she gave more, tried harder, waited longer, surely he would see her value. But the more she tried, the more distant he became. It wasn't just him pulling away. It was her abandoning herself in slow, quiet ways, skipping boundaries, dismissing her own needs, making excuses for his absence. She used to think love was about proving she was worth staying for, but now she knew better. Love isn't earned through self-sacrifice. It's revealed in how someone chooses to show up. And he didn't. So she stopped waiting, not with anger, but with wisdom. She learned to sit in the silence without rushing to fill it. The quiet used to feel like rejection, but now it felt like reflection. That's when Lena discovered something powerful. The way someone treats you is not about how lovable you are. It's about where they are in their own life. He couldn't love her well because he hadn't learned how to love himself fully. She'd been trying to teach someone how to show up when he hadn't even learned how to stay present for his own healing. And that wasn't her responsibility. She finally understood that healing doesn't mean you wait for them to grow. It means you grow beyond the need to wait. Letting go wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 little choices, each one saying, I deserve better, even when it hurt. She unfollowed him, not to be petty, but to reclaim her mental space. She stopped checking to see if he watched her stories. She stopped decoding his messages, stopped waiting for a sign. She no longer needed closure from someone who didn't offer clarity in the first place. The closure was in her decision to move forward, the kind of decision that says, even if you come back now, I won't be the same woman who once hoped you would. Her energy shifted. Friends noticed. She didn't talk about him anymore, not because she didn't care, but because she had nothing left to figure out. The story had played out. The lessons had been received. Now she was writing a new one. One where she wasn't chasing, questioning, or hoping. Instead, she was exploring her life again, traveling, saying yes to new experiences, laughing at jokes that weren't loaded with memories. Her joy returned, not in grand, dramatic waves, but in steady, quiet rhythms. It wasn't performative, it was personal, and that made it real. You can't fake peace, you have to earn it through truth. Then the pattern repeated. He reached out. A familiar, hey, been thinking about you. But Lena wasn't the same. She didn't jump, she didn't spiral. She felt the message land, observed it, and moved on. Not out of indifference, but out of growth. She knew what it really meant. He missed the comfort, not the commitment. He missed her presence, not the responsibility of maintaining it. And that was no longer enough for her. She didn't want to be someone's maybe or what if. She wanted a love that was sure, clear, consistent. The kind that doesn't make you question your worth every other week. For a long time, she had believed that walking away was failure. That if it didn't work out, it meant she wasn't enough. But now she knew the truth. Walking away was self-respect. It was the most courageous thing she could have done. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it honored her growth. She didn't block him. didn't send a long monologue. She just stopped participating in her own heartbreak. And in that decision, she took her power back. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, intentional, mature. That's the kind of power that changes everything because it can't be taken away. Lena started attracting different people into her life. Friends who poured into her without keeping score. Opportunities that aligned with her goals. Conversations that didn't revolve around confusion. She wasn't trying to fill a void anymore. She was building something, herself, a life that reflected her standards, not her wounds. And when you live like that, you naturally become magnetic. Not because you're seeking attention, but because you're radiating peace, confidence, alignment. That's the irony. When you stop begging for crumbs, you make room for the feast, the one you prepare for yourself, the one that doesn't require someone else to validate your hunger. She used to think she had to earn love by being easy to deal with, forgiving too quickly, minimizing her needs. Now she understood. The right person wouldn't want her to shrink. They'd respect her boundaries, match her effort, communicate clearly. Anything less wasn't love. It was emotional survival, and she had survived long enough. It was time to thrive, not just in romance, but in every part of her life. She finally realized her heart wasn't broken. It was expanding, making room for something bigger, something aligned, something that didn't feel like guessing games or second guessing her own intuition. Sometimes he still lingers in her thoughts, but not with longing, with gratitude. Gratitude for what that experience taught her. She doesn't hate him. She just outgrew the space where that version of her existed. And that's what growth looks like. Not proving your worth to the past, but choosing yourself in the present. Lena didn't need revenge. She didn't need to prove a point. Her life, her energy, her peace, that was the point. She became the woman who stopped hoping they'd change and instead became the kind of woman who doesn't settle for less than she deserves. And that changed everything. You don't need to block him. You don't need to beg. And you sure as hell don't need to break yourself trying to win someone back who didn't choose you. What if the most powerful move you could make was silence? Not cold, not petty, but intentional. What if shifting your energy, not your words, changed everything? Not to get him back, but to get you back, because that's where the real transformation begins. Sophie sat at the edge of her bed, phone in hand, heart in pieces. The silence on the screen was deafening. It had been days since he replied. No message, no explanation, just nothing. Every hour felt like a test of her worth. Her mind played games, replaying old memories, good mornings, sweet words that now felt like lies. Friends told her to block him, to walk away and never look back. But Sophie wasn't sure she was ready for that. Blocking felt like burning a bridge, and some part of her still hoped for closure. Maybe he'd realize what he lost. Maybe he'd wake up. Or maybe, she feared, he never cared in the first place. She opened the chat again, scrolling through past messages. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to send something, anything, to remind him she was still there. But deep down, she knew begging for attention doesn't win respect. A message wouldn't bring back his effort or make him see her differently. It would only reinforce what he already believed, that she'd always be available, that he could vanish and come back whenever he pleased. The thought stung. She closed the app and tossed her phone aside. The urge to reach out was strong, but something stronger was beginning to grow. Self-awareness. Sophie was done chasing what didn't want to be caught. She remembered what someone once told her. People don't respond to words, they respond to energy. And right now, her energy was desperate, unbalanced, low. That wasn't who she wanted to be. She didn't want to be someone waiting around for a man to make her feel worthy. She wanted to feel that worth with or without him. That night, she made a quiet promise to herself. She wouldn't beg, she wouldn't block. She would become someone so whole, so focused on her own growth that his silence would no longer define her. This wasn't about revenge or games. It was about healing, building, and rising. So she started small. She unfollowed him, not out of spite, but peace. She cleared her social media feeds of reminders, not to erase him, but to reclaim her space. She signed up for a morning yoga class. She started reading again. She met friends for coffee without talking about him. Day by day, the volume of his absence grew quieter, and the sound of her own voice grew louder. She journaled every night, not to obsess over what went wrong, but to reconnect with what made her feel alive. The woman who had been shrinking to fit someone else's love was expanding, slowly, beautifully, on her own terms. Weeks passed, and something amazing began to happen. Her energy shifted. People noticed. She walked differently. She spoke with clarity, smiled more, laughed from her gut. It wasn't an act. She was rediscovering parts of herself she'd buried to keep a man who was never really choosing her. And then it happened. A message. "Hey, been thinking about you. How have you been?" She stared at it for a moment, not with excitement, but clarity. The old Sophie would have replied immediately. The new Sophie took a deep breath and smiled. She had changed. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. The power in that moment wasn't in ignoring him. It was in realizing she no longer needed him. Not in the way she thought she did. He came back not because she begged for it, but because he could feel the shift. People always feel it when you stop chasing and start growing. Her silence, her space, her strength, they were louder than any message she could have sent. He didn't return because he missed who she was. He came back because he saw who she had become. And that, Sophie realized, was the most powerful revenge of all. Living well, truly, and fully for herself. Still, she didn't jump at the chance to reopen that door. She took her time, not to play hard to get, but because she valued herself now. She asked herself hard questions. Did she really want him back, or did she just miss who she was with him? The answers surprised her. What she missed most wasn't him, it was the version of herself that once believed she needed him to feel worthy. Now that version was gone. In its place was a woman with boundaries, self-respect, and a life that didn't revolve around someone else's approval. That was freedom. That was growth. This wasn't about being cold or heartless. Sophie still had feelings, but she learned not to let those feelings make her decision. She honored them, but didn't worship them. She could care and still choose herself. She could feel hurt and still move forward. What once felt like loss now felt like space. Space to build, to reflect, to grow. And maybe that's what most of us forget. Sometimes the best thing you can do isn't to block or beg, it's to build. Build a life so fulfilling that anyone who once overlooked you will feel that choice echo like a missed opportunity. The truth is, we teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. Sophie stopped tolerating breadcrumbs. She stopped confusing mixed signals for affection. She stopped lowering her standards just to feel wanted. And that shift, that quiet, consistent inner work, was what changed everything. She no longer feared being alone because she was no longer lonely with herself. She found joy in her own company, purpose in her passions, and strength in the silence. No text, no phone call, no half-hearted return could replace that. And that's what made her magnetic. Not her effort to be loved, but her refusal to be anything less than whole. Every time she felt the urge to reach out, she asked herself, am I doing this from love or from lack? That one question saved her countless times. It kept her from sending messages she'd regret. It kept her rooted in self-worth. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, she built something far more important than a relationship. She built self-trust. She knew that no matter who came or went, she would be okay. More than okay. She would thrive. Because she wasn't waiting for someone to choose her anymore. She had already chosen herself, and that choice would never let her down. The most shocking part, she didn't feel bitter, she felt grateful. Not for the heartbreak, but for the awakening. Losing him showed her how much of herself she had given away. Rebuilding taught her how much she was truly worth. It was never about punishing him or proving anything to him. It was about becoming someone so anchored in her own value that no silence, no rejection, no man could shake it. That's not ego. That's evolution. Sophie didn't block. She didn't beg. She became. And in the end, that made all the difference. Amira sat quietly in her apartment, the late-night silence louder than ever. Her phone sat on the table across the room, untouched. Though her thoughts circled it like a hawk. She had crafted a message in her mind at least a dozen times that day, explanations, emotions, memories, all swirling in her chest, begging to be released into a blue bubble of text. But this time, she did nothing. She didn't send it. Not because she didn't care, but because she was exhausted. Exhausted from always being the one to reach out, to explain, to fix. Silence used to scare her, but now it was starting to feel like power. This wasn't a game of pride or manipulation. Amira wasn't trying to be mysterious. She was trying to find her peace. The kind of peace that doesn't beg for attention or chase after people who don't choose you. She realized something vital. Every time she reached out first, she reinforced the idea that her love had to be earned through effort, through convincing. And deep down, she didn't want to convince anyone anymore. She wanted to be chosen freely, fully. She knew her value hadn't disappeared just because he stopped replying. What had disappeared was her willingness to tolerate inconsistency. Days passed. The temptation to speak still showed up like an uninvited guest. But instead of answering it, she turned inward. She started writing in her journal, not to vent about him, but to rediscover herself, her thoughts, her truth, her goals that had gotten buried under late-night phone calls and emotional chaos. For the first time in a long time, she started asking, what do I need right now? Not what he thought, not what he wanted, what she needed. And what she needed was space. Space to heal, space to breathe, space to rebuild the parts of herself she kept compromising to keep him interested. In the past, Amira thought silence meant losing, that if she didn't explain her side, he'd never understand. But now she saw it differently. Silence was clarity. It made room for the truth to rise without distortion. And in that space, she realized if he truly valued her, he wouldn't need reminders. He wouldn't need long texts explaining how to treat her. He would just show up. But he hadn't, and that silence told her more than any words ever could. It taught her that sometimes you don't need closure from them, you need closure from the version of yourself that tolerated being an option. Amira wasn't angry anymore, just clear. Clarity is quiet like that. It doesn't always arrive in a dramatic moment or a loud breakup. Sometimes it shows up in a calm, grounded decision to stop showing up for people who don't show up for you. She didn't block him. She didn't lash out. She didn't announce her worth. She simply stepped back. Let the space do the talking. Let the distance reveal the truth. Because when you stop chasing, the real dynamic reveals itself. And that's what happened. The longer she stayed silent, the more she saw things as they truly were. Then came the message, just like she suspected it would. Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay? Her heart skipped, but her mind stayed steady. She had waited for that message once upon a time. It would have meant everything back then. Now, it meant he noticed her absence, but not necessarily her value. And that was a critical difference. She read it twice and felt no urgency to respond. Not because she wanted to punish him, but because she had changed. She had stopped operating from desperation. Her silence wasn't about games, it was about alignment. She realized that sometimes the loudest statement you can make is no statement at all. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who never listened, you reclaim your voice. Amira's silence was not a weapon, it was a boundary. It said, I will no longer exhaust myself trying to make someone stay. That one shift in energy changed everything. Suddenly, she wasn't the one left waiting. She wasn't the one feeling powerless. She was in control, not of him, but of herself. And that control came from acceptance. Acceptance that his inconsistency wasn't a reflection of her worth, but of his readiness. As days turned into weeks, she noticed her world becoming richer without him. Her mornings felt lighter, her evenings were hers again. She started reading again, laughing more, showing up for herself in ways she used to wait for him to do. The silence gave her room to build a deeper relationship with herself, one where her needs weren't postponed for someone else's comfort, one where her heart wasn't up for negotiation, one where she could finally hear herself again without the noise of confusion, and that inner clarity became her compass. It pointed her forward, not backward. Every time the thought of messaging him crossed her mind, she paused. What outcome am I hoping for? If it was connection, she reminded herself, real connection doesn't require chasing. If it was clarity, she reminded herself, she already had it. If it was validation, she reminded herself, she no longer outsourced that. This self-check kept her grounded. It gave her power, not the kind that controls others, but the kind that protects your peace. And for Amira, that was everything. She no longer wanted to be seen. She wanted to be respected. And if she had to remind someone of her value, they were never qualified to hold it. She remembered how much energy she used to spend on someone who barely made space for her. And now she was pouring that same energy into herself, her dreams, her healing, her future. She didn't regret caring. She just regretted not caring for herself equally. But that was changing. Every day, she felt more like herself again. Not the version of herself who needed to be chosen, but the version who chose herself. And the beautiful irony? That version of Amira was the most magnetic of all. Not because she was trying to be, but because she was finally being. He messaged again and again, this time with more words, more effort, more curiosity. But she no longer craved his curiosity. She craved depth, effort, intention. And from him, that had always been missing. So she didn't rush to reply. She wasn't cold, just clear. That clarity came from letting the silence speak, from trusting that if someone needs your voice to remember your value, they were never really listening in the first place. Her silence didn't break her connection, it revealed it. And what it revealed was enough for her to finally choose peace over potential. And herself above all.